He left her for a lie, but at a gala 4 years later, the truth stared back at him, with his own eyes. 4 years ago, Claire stood on the train platform, her hands trembling slightly as they clutched a sealed envelope she had written a dozen times and rewritten a dozen more. It was addressed to Alexander, the man she loved and the man she thought she would share her life with. In that envelope were the words she couldn't bring herself to say face to face, that she was pregnant, that she needed him, that she wasn't strong enough to do this alone. But just days before, she had heard the news that shattered her. Alexander was marrying Jessica, a glamorous blonde who claimed she was carrying his child. Claire remembered the way her legs gave out beneath her when she saw the engagement headline, the same photograph of them splashed across the internet, Jessica's hand resting possessively on his chest, her diamond ring catching the light. It wasn't just that he had moved on, it was that he had done it so quickly, so thoroughly, without looking back. Claire could barely breathe as she watched the train arrive. She had planned to go to his office that morning, planned to hand him the letter in person, planned to ask him to listen. But what was the point now? He had chosen. He had made his decision. And Jessica, with her soft manipulations and carefully calculated charm, had won. What Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Alexander had been as shocked as she was when Jessica told him about the pregnancy. He had been distant from Claire, yes, but never unfaithful. Yet Jessica insisted the timing made sense, and Alexander, always the man of logic and responsibility, had believed her. Claire, unaware of his turmoil, stepped onto the train that would take her out of the city and out of his life, never turning back. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet, numbing devastation. Claire moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, far from the city's sharp memories and far from the reminders of a life that was no longer hers. She began freelance work in graphic design, taking on any client who would pay and working late into the night just to afford prenatal vitamins and rent. When she went in for her first ultrasound and saw 2 tiny heartbeats blinking on the screen, her chest tightened with a bittersweet pain. Twins. She had never expected this. Never planned it. But in that moment, something shifted. If Alexander wasn't going to be a part of their lives, then she would do it alone. She would be enough. She had to be. And she would never let him see her break. Claire never spoke his name again. Not to friends, not to family. When her parents asked, she simply said they had split and changed the subject. She refused to explain. She refused to justify. The pain she carried was hers alone, and she buried it deep beneath layers of self-reliance and quiet determination. Every kick, every ultrasound, every sleepless night she endured without him made her stronger, made her more certain that even if he had never truly loved her, her daughters would. And that would be enough. It had to be. Claire's apartment was small, but every corner of it bore her fingerprints, her stubborn efforts, and the echo of lullabies whispered into the silence of long nights. She had brought the girls home after a difficult labor, exhausted but filled with a wild, protective love that made her feel both invincible and painfully vulnerable. Emma and Lily, though born just minutes apart, had already begun showing their own tiny personalities. Emma cried louder, hungrier, demanded attention with fierce little fists and a steady glare. Lily was quieter, watching her sister, always curious, content just to be close. Claire often sat between their bassinets, holding both of their hands at once, murmuring promises she never made aloud to anyone else, that she would never leave them, that she would never let them feel unwanted, that they would never know the weight of someone else's rejection. Days blurred into nights as Claire juggled the relentless rhythm of newborn life with the grind of work. She built her freelance portfolio from scratch, sending pitches during midnight feedings and designing logos with a baby on each knee. Money was always tight. There were nights she skipped meals to buy formula, days when she walked miles instead of taking the bus so she could stretch her budget. The struggle wore on her body, and there were moments, brief, frightening moments, when she'd stand in the shower and let the water hide the sound of her crying, terrified that she wasn't enough. That love wasn't enough. But every morning, when her daughters woke and blinked up at her with those impossibly familiar blue eyes, his eyes, she found another thread of strength and held on tighter. There were days she thought of Alexander. Not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache that never left her. She wondered if he ever thought of her. If he ever looked at Jessica and felt a pang of doubt. But then she would remember the headlines, the glossy photos of charity galas and tech awards, his arm always wrapped around Jessica's waist, his gaze always just distant enough to seem unreadable. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe it had never meant as much to him as it had to her. Claire had no room for fantasies. She had to keep moving forward, one step, one bill, one diaper at a time. When the girls were 2, Claire finally landed a steady client, a boutique design agency that admired her sharp eye and clean aesthetic. The work was demanding, but it allowed her to hire part-time childcare and breathe, just a little. She started painting again in the evenings, something she hadn't done since college, and for the first time in years, she felt something stir in her that wasn't just survival. Life was still hard, but it was hers. The twins grew into bright, spirited toddlers who filled the apartment with chaos and laughter. Emma was bold and fearless, always the first to climb, the first to leap, the first to argue. Lily was quieter, but clever, always watching, always understanding more than she let on. Claire taught them to say please and thank you, to respect others, to ask questions, and most of all, to trust themselves. They didn't ask about their father often, and when they did, Claire answered carefully, never with resentment, always with grace. "He's not with us, but you are loved more than you can imagine," she would say, and it was the truth. Still, in the deepest part of her, a quiet longing remained, not for Alexander, but for justice, for truth, for the pieces of her story to finally make sense. She never sought revenge, never wished harm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that one day, somehow, everything would come full circle. She didn't know when or how. She only knew that secrets had a way of rising. And she had nothing left to hide. By the time the girls turned 3, Claire had begun to rebuild her life into something more than just manageable. The weight of survival that had once pressed on her chest like a stone had lightened, replaced with a sense of purpose that came not only from being a mother but from reclaiming herself as a woman, an artist, and a person who had dreams beyond endurance. She had recently moved into a slightly larger apartment closer to the city's edge, one with a small balcony where the girls could grow potted flowers and she could drink her coffee in the early morning before they woke up. The space still bore the signs of modest living, but Claire had learned to find beauty in simplicity. She hung her own artwork on the walls, filled the shelves with second-hand books, and let the girls scatter their toys without worrying about perfection. This was a home built on love, and despite the fatigue etched into her every movement, there was peace in knowing she had created it all with her own hands. Her career had started to flourish in ways she hadn't anticipated. The boutique agency she had partnered with began recommending her to other clients, and slowly she gained a reputation in the design world as someone who could create visual stories with emotion and depth. She specialized in branding for small businesses owned by women, often entrepreneurs who, like her, had started with nothing and were clawing their way into visibility. Claire connected with them not just through her work, but through shared experience, and that empathy infused every project she touched. She was still working late nights, still answering emails during lunch breaks at the playground, but now the chaos carried hope. She could see a future shaping up in the distance, not just for her daughters but for herself. Emma and Lily, now full of opinions and energy, had started attending a preschool just a few blocks away. Claire walked them there each morning, one on each hand, their small voices filling the street with questions about trees and clouds and bugs. To outsiders, they looked like any other happy family, and Claire let them believe it. She didn't owe the world her pain. The girls were thriving, smart, joyful, and so close it was as if they shared the same thoughts before speaking. They finished each other's sentences, invented their own games, and had a silent language only twins seemed to understand. Claire often watched them with a bittersweet ache in her chest, wondering how long it would be before they started asking more complicated questions about their father. She had rehearsed the answers in her head 100 times but never spoke them aloud. Not yet. Not until they were ready. The truth was heavy, and she had learned to carry it alone. Still, there were moments when the past crept in without warning. One afternoon, while organizing files on her computer, she stumbled upon an old photo, her and Alexander, before everything had fallen apart. They were at a lake, laughing, his arms slung around her shoulders, the kind of effortless intimacy that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Her stomach twisted, not out of longing, but out of recognition. She hadn't been mistaken about their connection. It had been real. Which made his silence, his absence, all the more painful. Still, she closed the photo, not deleting it but not looking back at it again either. What Claire didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that Alexander's world had quietly begun to fracture. His company was thriving, his public persona intact, but behind the scenes, the foundation he had built with Jessica was starting to crumble. Their marriage, always more of a performance than a partnership, had grown cold and strained. Jessica had everything money could buy but lived with the gnawing fear that Alexander had never truly belonged to her. She could feel him slipping further away with each passing year, distracted, emotionally absent, often lost in thought. He rarely looked at her anymore. And when he did, there was something in his eyes she couldn't name, doubt, maybe, or worse, regret. Claire, unaware of the cracks spreading through Alexander's life, focused solely on her daughters. Her world was built around small, steady rituals, pancakes on Sunday mornings, trips to the local library, bedtime stories curled under one blanket. She poured herself into those moments, letting them anchor her through everything else. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Every giggle, every crayon drawing taped to the fridge, every whispered, "I love you, Mommy," reminded her that she had made the right choice. Even if the rest of the world never knew what she had sacrificed, her daughters did. And that was enough. At least, it had to be. The charity gala had not been something Claire had planned to attend, but her friend from the design agency had begged her to come, insisting it would be a great opportunity to meet potential clients and showcase her work. The event was being held at an elegant venue in the heart of the city, a glittering space filled with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and too many people pretending to care about the cause more than the photo opportunities. Claire, dressed in a simple but beautifully tailored black dress she had borrowed from a friend, arrived with minimal expectations and even less desire to network. She had left the girls with her trusted neighbor, kissed their foreheads goodnight, and told herself she could survive a few hours of small talk and champagne if it meant opening a new door professionally. What she never anticipated was coming face to face with the past she had buried years ago. Alexander arrived late, as he often did when attending events more out of obligation than genuine interest. He had grown tired of these functions, of shaking hands with men who only wanted his money and smiling at women who only wanted his name. Jessica, as always, had insisted they attend, but she had been unusually quiet that evening, distracted, her phone never far from her hand. He barely noticed. His mind had been elsewhere for weeks, haunted by memories that had resurfaced for no clear reason: an old perfume in a hallway, a stranger's laugh in a cafe, a sketch he found in a magazine that reminded him of Claire's work. Her name had come up in conversation recently too, from a colleague who mentioned hiring a brilliant designer for their new startup. The name hadn't registered at first, but when he saw the portfolio, his chest tightened. It was her. It had to be. As Claire stood near a small display of her donated artwork, sipping sparkling water and trying to avoid the gaze of anyone too curious, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned instinctively, prepared to offer a polite smile, but the breath left her body when she saw him. He was taller than she remembered, broader somehow, his features more defined, as if the years had carved him into someone colder, more distant. But his eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes, were the same. And they were staring right at her, stunned and searching. Alexander didn't speak. Neither did she. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, frozen in a bubble of disbelief that none of the glittering lights or murmuring guests could penetrate. Claire's heart pounded so violently she was afraid it might give her away, but she kept her expression calm, her posture still. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much his presence shook her. But then his gaze shifted, just slightly, over her shoulder, and the illusion shattered. The twins had been brought by Claire's friend for a brief surprise visit, something she had planned to lift Claire's spirits. She hadn't expected them to arrive so soon. Emma and Lily, dressed in matching pastel sweaters and tiny silver shoes, came running toward her, their laughter cutting through the ambient music like a blade. "Mommy," they cried in unison, and Claire instinctively bent down, wrapping them both in her arms. When she stood again, Alexander's face had changed completely. He stared at the girls as if he were seeing ghosts. His eyes locked onto theirs, and in that instant, he knew. There was no need for a DNA test, no whispered confession. They had his eyes, his expression, even the same way of tilting their heads when curious. The truth hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away years of certainty, of choices made based on lies. Jessica's pregnancy, the rushed marriage, the years of emotional disconnection, it all began to unravel in his mind. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Claire, her voice quiet and firm, simply said, "It's not the time or the place." She turned and walked away with the girls, not running, not hiding, but refusing to let him reclaim the moment. Alexander stood motionless, surrounded by people who had no idea that his world had just been torn apart. Jessica appeared at his side moments later, asking something meaningless, but he didn't hear her. His eyes were still fixed on the place where Claire had stood. The woman he had once loved. The woman he had left. And the children he never knew he had. He felt as if he had been asleep for years, and now, without warning, had woken up in a different life, one that belonged to him, yet he had no part in shaping. That night, long after the gala ended and the guests had gone home, Alexander sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. His phone lay face down on the desk beside him. For hours, he said nothing, did nothing. Just sat in silence, listening to the sound of his own breathing, trying to reconcile the truth with the lies he had believed for far too long. In his chest, something cracked open, not just grief, but something deeper. A slow, growing realization that everything he had built was meaningless if it was built on betrayal. He had been living someone else's version of his life. And now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he really was. But he knew one thing with certainty: he had to see Claire again. And this time, she would get the truth she deserved. Alexander left the gala with his chest heavy and his thoughts unraveling in every direction. The sight of the little girls had followed him into the night, into his car, into his bed where sleep never came. He turned on the lights, turned them off, paced the length of his house like a stranger trapped inside someone else's walls. Their eyes haunted him the most, blue like his, but brighter, untouched by regret. Every time he closed his own, he saw their faces peeking out from behind Claire's skirt, curious and innocent, as if they already knew who he was. By morning, his decision had already taken shape, though he feared it as much as he needed it. He had to know. The address came easily, as if it had been waiting for him all along, tucked between memories he had tried to bury. When he stood on Claire's doorstep, the sun was weak and pale, the kind of morning light that makes everything appear fragile. He didn't know how long he lingered there before knocking, hearing his pulse louder than the sound of his hand against the wood. When the door opened, Claire was there, hair a little untamed, dressed simply, her eyes steady in a way that disarmed him. She did not flinch. She did not ask why he had come. She looked at him as if she had been expecting this moment for years. He parted his lips but could not form the words. His throat was dry, his jaw tight, and yet the only thing that left him was the question he had been choking on since the night before. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice raw, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. Claire did not answer right away. Her silence stretched between them like a veil, and he realized he had been holding his breath. When she finally nodded, it was with neither shame nor triumph, only quiet acceptance. "I wanted to tell you," she said softly, "but you were already gone." The weight of her words struck him with the force of years lost, years stolen, years he could never recover. Behind her, he could see faint evidence of a life built without him: children's shoes by the wall, drawings pinned to the fridge, 2 small jackets hung neatly on hooks. Each detail cut into him, a reminder that he had missed first steps, first words, first nights when they cried and she soothed them alone. He felt his chest tighten, not with anger but with a grief so profound it made his hands tremble. He left without argument, without plea. He needed air. He needed to stand outside of her world before it swallowed him whole. On the drive home, his vision blurred with thoughts he had refused to entertain before. Jessica's smile, too wide, too calculated. Her story of pregnancy that had bound him to her, the sudden announcement that had seemed like fate but now rang hollow. The timing, the fragile way she had wrapped herself around his guilt. By the time he entered his house, he was seeing her clearly for the first time in years. She was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as though the world had not shifted. And in that moment, he knew with certainty, everything he had endured, every choice that had led him here, had been built on a lie. The days that followed were a storm made public, a spectacle of whispers, headlines, and accusations that spread faster than either Alexander or Jessica could contain. The divorce began like a spark, a single declaration, but quickly roared into a fire that drew the attention of neighbors, colleagues, and society pages. Jessica wept in courtrooms, her voice sharp and breaking, first pleading with him to remember their vows, then threatening to ruin what remained of his reputation. She clutched at memories that were already hollow, fabricating sincerity where none had ever lived. The world saw her tears, but Alexander, for the first time, saw past them, and what he felt was not fury but an unshakable emptiness, as if the strings that had once bound him to her life had snapped silently in the night. When the truth surfaced, when it was revealed that there had never been a child, never the loss he had grieved for, there was no explosion inside him, no violent rage demanding retribution. There was only a profound quiet, a clarity he had never allowed himself to feel before. He remembered the nights when he had lain beside Jessica, listening to the rhythm of her breath, trying to force affection into the hollow space between them. He remembered convincing himself that sacrifice was a kind of honor, that a man kept his promises no matter what. Now he understood it had not been honor but blindness, and the fog of that blindness finally lifted. While the legal battles unfolded with their cruel efficiency, his steps began to lead him elsewhere, almost without thought. He found himself returning to Claire's world in fragments, at first hesitant, always carrying the weight of guilt that pressed against his chest like an uninvited guest. He did not rush her. He knew he had no right to demand forgiveness simply because his own cage had shattered. Instead, he asked for the smallest of permissions, a conversation at her kitchen table, a moment to walk with her in the park while the girls ran ahead, a chance to bring them a storybook at night and linger by the door as she tucked them in. The rhythm of these visits became their own kind of healing. He began to see how Claire lived, how she had built a life out of quiet strength, how the girls filled her days with laughter and chaos and exhaustion that she bore with grace. In the park he learned to chase after them, to lift them high above his shoulders until they shrieked with delight, to sit cross-legged on the grass answering their endless questions. He noticed how they leaned into him naturally, without hesitation, as if some instinct had already told them who he was long before he had spoken it aloud. And then there were the silences, those long stretches of time where he and Claire spoke without words. She would watch him clumsily braid a doll's hair or struggle with the tiny clasps on a pair of shoes, and he could feel the walls between them shifting. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a softening, a quiet acknowledgement that he was trying. At night, when he returned to an empty house stripped of Jessica's perfume and staged perfection, he found himself holding on to those moments more tightly than anything else. The scandal raged around them, but Alexander no longer cared. The lawyers debated, the reporters speculated, Jessica performed her grief for an audience that grew weary of her theatrics, but he had already stepped beyond it all. Each day with Claire and the children became a thread, delicate but real, weaving something new out of the ruins of his old life. He began to understand that what he was seeking was not to erase the past but to build a present that could endure, and for the first time in years, he felt the faint warmth of hope pressing against the cold edges of his chest. Emma and Lily accepted Alexander into their lives with such effortless joy that it startled him. To them, his absence was not a wound but a gap easily bridged, as though he had simply been away on a long business trip and was now returning home. They tugged at his sleeves with sticky hands, demanded his attention with laughter and stubbornness, and welcomed him into their games as if he had always been part of their world. At first he felt clumsy, uncertain in every gesture, afraid of breaking the fragile rhythm of their childhood with his heavy steps. He fumbled with shoelaces and hair ties, struggled to balance tiny barrettes in their silky dark hair, and spent long minutes deciphering the construction manuals of Lego castles that always seemed impossible to him but effortless to them. They watched him with amusement, correcting him without judgment, and when he finally got it right, their cheers filled the room with a warmth that shook him to his core. The bedtime routines were the hardest, and also the most rewarding. Reading aloud was foreign to him, his voice felt too rough, too steady, as if it did not belong in the soft glow of a child's room. But when Emma curled against his side and Lily pressed her head to his arm, their breathing deepened as he turned the pages, and for the first time in years he felt something close to peace. He learned that the pauses mattered more than the words, that they liked when he made the wolves sound ridiculous and when the princesses were brave instead of helpless. It was in those quiet moments, surrounded by the weight of small bodies trusting him without hesitation, that Alexander realized how much of life he had lost. He thought of the years gone by, of the nights when Claire must have stood alone by these same bedsides, whispering comfort while he lay awake elsewhere, believing in lies. Claire watched him from a distance in those early weeks, her gaze cautious but not cold. She studied the way he bent down to tie a shoe, how he let the girls braid his hair with plastic clips until he looked ridiculous, how he answered their endless questions with patience he had never known he possessed. She was not quick to forgive, and he did not ask her to. He knew that forgiveness could not be demanded, it had to be earned slowly, like trust rebuilt stone by stone. There were moments when their eyes met across a room and the weight of the past pressed heavily between them, moments when silence stretched long enough to remind them of everything that had been broken. Yet in those same silences there was something else too, a fragile new possibility that neither of them dared to name. For Alexander, the transformation was not sudden but gradual, unfolding in small victories. He learned how to pack a school bag without forgetting snacks, how to braid hair with smoother fingers, how to patch a scraped knee without panicking. Each new task, however simple, became a milestone, proof that he was no longer just a man defined by betrayal and regret but a father learning to exist in the world of his daughters. The awkwardness that had once marked his presence began to fade, replaced by something natural, something steady. He found himself anticipating their laughter, their hugs, even their tantrums, because all of it was real, all of it belonged to the life he had once thought forever beyond his reach. Claire saw the change as well. She noticed how his shoulders, once rigid and burdened, began to relax, how the lines in his face softened when he listened to the girls chatter about their day, how his voice shifted when he spoke to them, gentle, patient, unlike the guarded tone she remembered from before. She did not let go of her caution, but she no longer held on to resentment with the same iron grip. Something in her began to ease, like ice thawing slowly under spring sunlight. She had built walls to protect herself and her children, but Alexander did not try to break them down with force. Instead, he stood before them day after day, not demanding entry but simply waiting, showing through action rather than promises that he intended to stay. As the months passed, Alexander discovered that fatherhood was not only about being present but about listening, about learning, about showing up even when exhausted or uncertain. It was in the small questions, the quiet gestures, the willingness to sit on the floor surrounded by dolls and blocks after a long day. It was in the way the girls looked at him as if he were their hero simply for existing at their side. And slowly, in the rhythm of their shared days, Alexander felt a second chance taking root. It was not the repetition of what he and Claire had once been, but something altogether new, fragile yet resilient, a reinvention rather than a return. He carried the weight of the past but no longer let it crush him, because for the first time he was not living in duty or lies, he was living in truth. A year later the memory of that night at the fountain still lingered in Alexander's mind, not as a wound anymore but as a point of origin, the moment where his life had shifted from illusion to truth. Time had stretched and folded since then, weaving together days filled with ordinary tasks and unexpected joys. By the time Emma and Lily were ready for their preschool graduation, he had already become part of their world so seamlessly that even he sometimes struggled to remember what it had been like to live without them. The morning of the ceremony he found himself nervously straightening their tiny dresses while they twirled impatiently in front of the mirror, demanding his approval for ribbons and hair clips. Claire watched from the doorway with an amused smile, handing him the comb when he faltered, their eyes meeting in a quiet acknowledgement of how far things had come. At the school, the hall buzzed with the laughter of parents and the squeals of children, decorations taped to the walls with uneven lines and glitter scattered across the floor. Alexander stood with the other families, but instead of feeling like an intruder, he felt a belonging he had once thought forever denied to him. The girls waved at him from the stage, their small faces lit with excitement, their voices joining the chorus of songs rehearsed for weeks. He clutched the program in his hand, his throat tightening with emotion as he realized he was witnessing not only a milestone in their young lives but also in his own. For years he had dreamed of fatherhood only to have it stolen by lies, and now, in this imperfect but real moment, he was living it. Claire stood beside him, her posture calm, her expression serene, and though they did not speak, he felt her presence as steady as an anchor. There had been no declarations between them, no dramatic reconciliations. Instead, there had been a slow rebuilding, a quiet layering of trust and respect that had grown stronger with each shared day. He knew she had not forgotten the pain of the past, but she no longer carried it as a shield. Instead, she carried gratitude for the present, and in her calm gaze he saw something he had never expected to find again, a willingness to let life move forward. When the ceremony ended, he held both girls' hands as they skipped down the steps, their tiny diplomas clutched proudly in their arms. The sunlight bathed them in gold, their laughter ringing out as they pulled him and Claire toward the crowd of celebrating families. He realized then that what had once been broken had not disappeared, but instead had been transformed into the foundation of something stronger, not flawless but resilient, not perfect but true. The fractures of the past remained, but they no longer defined him, no longer defined them. That evening, after the celebration had quieted and the girls had collapsed into bed from sheer excitement, Alexander found himself on the porch with Claire, the air cool and scented with the promise of summer. He turned to her not with rehearsed words but with the simple impulse of a man who had finally learned to speak plainly. He suggested a weekend away, a trip to the mountains where the four of them could escape the routines and distractions, where they could breathe in the silence of pine trees and let the girls chase butterflies on winding trails. For a moment she studied him, her eyes unreadable, and he braced himself for hesitation. But then she smiled, softly, steadily, and said yes. Her answer carried no weight of reluctance, no shadow of bitterness, only the simple truth that families belong together. In that instant, Alexander felt something he had not felt since boyhood, the sensation of coming home. It was not the return to a house or a life he once knew, but the arrival at a place he had never truly been before. It was a home made not of walls but of laughter, of forgiveness earned, of love rediscovered in its most unadorned form. And as he looked at Claire in the fading light, he understood that the journey was not finished, that there would still be struggles and missteps ahead, but for the first time he welcomed them. Because this time, he was not walking alone.